Mom, did you enjoy the money from Dad's Mustang? My son's question cut through the laughter at the dinner table so suddenly that I nearly dropped my fork. For a moment nobody moved. The birthday candles flickered softly between us. The smell of roasted turkey and sweet cornbread still lingered in the dining room. My granddaughter Emily had been laughing just seconds earlier, telling me about her first semester at college. The radio in the kitchen played an old Frank Sinatra song my late husband used to love. And then everything changed. I looked at Daniel across the table, certain I must have misunderstood him. The money from what? I asked quietly. Daniel frowned. Dad's Mustang, Mom. The one Claire sold last spring. Didn't she give you the check? Beside him, my daughter-in-law froze so completely she almost didn't look real anymore. Claire slowly lowered her wine glass onto the tablecloth. Too carefully. Too quietly. I felt something cold move through my chest. I never received any money, I said. The room fell silent. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Sometimes the people closest to us hide the deepest betrayals. Claire forced a smile then. The kind of smile people use when they're trying to hold a door shut against a storm. Oh, Harold, she said softly to my son, using the nickname she always called him when she wanted to calm him down. Maybe your mother forgot. It was months ago. Forgot?
Isterte her.
My late husband's 1968 Mustang wasn't just some old car someone could casually forget about. Frank had spent 15 years restoring that car in our garage outside Columbus, Ohio. Every Sunday morning, he'd walk out there with a rag over his shoulder and old country music humming from the radio. That car had been his pride. And after cancer took him 2 years ago, it became the one thing in this world I could still touch that felt like him. I remembered sitting in the passenger seat during summer evenings while Frank drove us along quiet roads outside town, his hand resting lightly on the gear shift, his smile easy and warm beneath the fading sunlight. You keep this beauty running after I'm gone, he used to joke. Back then we both laughed. Now I could barely breathe. Daniel looked confused. Mom, Claire handled everything because you said dealing with paperwork stressed you out. I slowly turned toward him. I never told anyone to sell your father's car. Claire's face lost color. Only slightly, but enough. Emily glanced nervously between her parents. Even my 8-year-old grandson Mason stopped eating mashed potatoes and looked up from his plate. Children always know when something bad enters a room. Claire reached for her wine again, but her fingers trembled this time. Well, she began carefully, the garage fees were becoming expensive and the car was just sitting there. I thought. You thought. I interrupted gently. My own voice surprised me. It wasn't loud. Wasn't angry. Just tired. Very tired. Daniel blinked rapidly. Wait. Claire told me you agreed to sell it because you needed the money. I stared at my son for several long seconds. At 42 years old, he still had the same blue eyes he'd had as a little boy. Frank's eyes. Honest eyes. But tonight they looked uncertain. Lost. And suddenly I realized something painful. My son truly believed whatever Claire told him. The birthday dinner around us no longer felt warm and cozy. The dining room lights suddenly seemed too bright. The air too heavy. I noticed small things then. Claire avoiding my eyes. Daniel rubbing the back of his neck nervously. Emily quietly setting down her fork. Tiny details. Tiny cracks. The kind that appear before an entire wall collapses. I'd like to know exactly how much the Mustang sold for, I said calmly. Claire answered too quickly. 40,000. Daniel looked at her sharply. I thought you said 48. There it was. Another silence. Sharper this time. Claire swallowed hard. Oh, after taxes and transport fees and restoration commissions, she stammered. But her words sounded messy now. Loose. Like a sweater beginning to unravel thread by thread. I folded my hands neatly in my lap. Outside, snow drifted softly against the dining room windows. The December wind rattled the old maple tree near the driveway. Somewhere upstairs, the grandfather clock Frank inherited from his father chimed 7 slow times. For the first time since my husband died, I felt something stronger than grief. Suspicion. Deep icy suspicion. And sitting there at my own 68th birthday dinner, surrounded by family, I realized I no longer knew the woman sitting across from me. But worse than that, wasn't sure I knew my son anymore either. I didn't sleep that night. After everyone left, I stood alone in my kitchen rinsing dishes that still smelled faintly of garlic butter and birthday cake frosting. The house had gone quiet again, the way it always did after family gatherings. But this silence felt different. Heavier. Like something ugly had been left behind at the table with the crumbs and empty glasses. I turned off the faucet and looked through the kitchen window toward the detached garage at the edge of my property. Snow covered the roof in a thin white layer. The motion light near the side door flickered weakly in the wind. That garage used to glow warm every Saturday morning. Frank would disappear out there for hours with a coffee thermos and his old tool belt hanging from his hip. Sometimes I'd bring him sandwiches around noon and find him bent over the Mustang's engine, grease on his hands and old rock music echoing from the radio. "You hear that?" he'd ask proudly whenever the engine started clean. "That's American engineering right there." I used to laugh at how much he loved that car. Now the garage sat dark and empty, and somehow I had never even noticed when the Mustang disappeared. That realization hurt more than I wanted to admit. At 68 years old, grief had changed me in ways I still didn't fully understand. After Frank died, the days blurred together. I stopped paying attention to things outside my routines. Coffee at 6. Medication after breakfast. Grocery shopping on Tuesdays. Church on Sundays. I survived quietly. That's what widows do sometimes. We survive so quietly that the world starts moving furniture around us without asking permission. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around myself and walked slowly into the living room. Frank's recliner still sat beside the fireplace exactly where he left it. I hadn't moved it in 2 years. People told me it was unhealthy, but they didn't understand. Some objects become anchors after loss. The recliner, his reading glasses, the faded Browns blanket folded over the armrest, and the Mustang, or at least I thought it was still mine to hold on to. I lowered myself carefully onto the couch and stared at the old family photographs lining the mantel. There was Daniel at age 10 holding a baseball trophy, Emily as a toddler sitting on Frank's shoulders. One photo from 20 years ago showed all of us smiling beside the Mustang during a 4th of July parade downtown. Claire looked different back then. Softer. Or maybe I had simply wanted to believe she was. When Daniel first brought her home 15 years ago, I tried hard to welcome her into the family. She was polished, ambitious, confident in ways I never had been. She worked in real estate, wore expensive perfume, always knew exactly what to say in social situations. Frank liked her immediately. "She's sharp," he told me once after dinner. "That girl knows how to take care of herself." At the time I thought that was a compliment. Now I wasn't so sure. Little memories began surfacing that night like objects floating up from deep water. Claire asking detailed questions about our finances after Frank got sick. Claire insisting she help organize our paperwork. Claire offering to simplify things after the funeral because she knew I was overwhelmed. At the time, her help had seemed thoughtful, loving even. But now, I remembered something else. About 8 months ago, I had walked into the garage looking for an old box of Christmas decorations. The Mustang had still been there then, covered beneath Frank's navy blue protective tarp. Claire happened to be visiting that afternoon. "Oh, Evelyn," she'd said casually when she saw me touching the car cover. "You really should think about selling that thing someday. Classic cars are more trouble than they're worth." I remembered smiling politely. It was Frank's favorite possession, I told her. Claire shrugged. "Well, memories don't pay bills." At the time I thought it was just an insensitive comment. Now those words echoed differently in my head. Memories don't pay bills. Around midnight I finally stood and walked upstairs to my bedroom. Frank's side of the bed remained untouched except for fresh sheets I changed every Sunday. Some habits become sacred after loss. I sat carefully on the mattress and opened the top drawer of my nightstand. Inside sat a small velvet jewelry box containing Frank's wedding band and a folded piece of paper in his handwriting. I unfolded it slowly. "If anything ever happens to me, promise you won't let anyone pressure you into giving up what matters to you." I closed my eyes. Frank wrote that during his second round of chemotherapy. At the time I thought he was talking about the house. Now I wondered if he had seen something I hadn't. The next morning, Snow covered the driveway in fresh white layers nearly 3 inches deep. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen counter watching birds gather near the frozen bird feeder outside. At 9:15 my phone rang. It was Daniel. "Morning, Mom." His voice sounded strained, like he hadn't slept either. "Morning." A pause. Then quietly, "Claire says there's been some misunderstanding about the Mustang." I stared down into my coffee cup. The dark liquid trembled slightly in my hands. "Did she tell you where the money went?" I asked. Another pause. No, that single word settled heavily between us. For the first time since Frank died, I heard uncertainty in my son's voice when he spoke about his wife. And deep down, I knew something had already started to crack. Daniel came over that afternoon alone. That was the first thing that made my stomach tighten. Claire never let him visit by himself unless something was wrong. I watched through the living room curtains as his black SUV pulled slowly into my driveway. Snow crunched beneath his boots when he stepped out carrying a cardboard tray of coffee cups from the diner near his office. A peace offering. My son always brought coffee when he felt guilty. By the time he knocked, I already had the kettle boiling on the stove. "You don't have to knock," I said softly as I opened the door. "You grew up here." Daniel forced a tired smile, but the skin beneath his eyes looked gray with exhaustion. "Habit, I guess." Cold air swept into the hallway as he stepped inside. He smelled faintly of winter wind and expensive cologne. Not Frank's kind of cologne. Frank used Old Spice his entire life because, according to him, a man shouldn't smell like a candle shop. That thought almost made me smile. Almost. Daniel set the coffees on the kitchen counter while I pulled mugs from the cabinet. Neither of us spoke for a few moments. The silence between family members feels different when trust begins slipping away. Careful. Fragile. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. "Claire said she handled the Mustang sale because she thought it would help you financially." I kept my eyes on the coffee I was pouring. "Did she?" "She said you told her maintaining the garage and insurance was becoming stressful." I handed him a mug. "Daniel, I haven't driven that car since your father got sick." "I know." "Then why would I suddenly decide to sell it without even saying goodbye to it?" He didn't answer. Outside the kitchen window, snow continued drifting across the backyard in slow white waves. The maple tree branches bent gently beneath the weight of ice. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice before everything went quiet again. Daniel wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "When I asked Claire about the money this morning," he said carefully, "she got defensive." That word landed heavily. Defensive. Not confused. Not concerned. Defensive. I sat down slowly across from him at the kitchen table Frank built himself 25 years ago. The wood still carried small scratches from holiday dinners, homework sessions, and Emily's childhood coloring projects. A family table remembers everything. "How much did the car actually sell for?" I asked. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "She told me 40,000 at first. But last night," he exhaled slowly, "the numbers kept changing." I nodded once, quietly, as though some part of me had already expected that answer. Then Daniel said something that made my chest tighten. "There's something else." I looked up. "She asked me not to involve you anymore." For a moment I simply stared at him. "What does that mean?" "She said discussing finances stresses you out, and that after Dad died, you became forgetful about paperwork." Forgetful. The word hit harder than I expected. Not because of pride. Because I suddenly understood the shape of what Claire had been building. Not one lie. A pattern. Small suggestions planted carefully over time. Your mother gets confused sometimes. She forgets things. She doesn't understand finances. Tiny comments. Tiny seeds. The kind people barely notice until suddenly everyone believes them. I folded my hands together to stop them trembling. "Do you think I'm losing my memory, Daniel?" His eyes widened immediately. "No. Mom, no. Of course not." But he hesitated. Only for half a second. Still, I noticed. And once a mother notices hesitation in her child, she can never fully unsee it. Daniel looked down into his coffee again. "She handled most of Dad's paperwork near the end," he admitted quietly. "I trusted her." I thought about Frank lying weak and exhausted in the hospice bed downstairs during his final weeks. Claire moving calmly through the house carrying folders and envelopes. Speaking gently. Offering help before anyone even asked. Back then, I'd been too consumed by grief to pay attention. Maybe that was exactly when she started taking control. Daniel suddenly stood and began pacing slowly near the kitchen island. I checked our joint savings account this morning, he said. There's less money than there should be. I felt my stomach sink. How much less? He gave a hollow laugh. I'm still trying to figure that out. The room grew very still. I remembered all the little luxuries Claire suddenly started displaying over the past year. The designer handbags. The kitchen renovation. The girls' trip to Scottsdale she claimed her friend paid for. At the time I assumed Daniel's promotion covered it all. Now I wasn't certain. Daniel stopped pacing and looked toward the garage through the kitchen window. I should have known something was wrong when the Mustang disappeared. You thought I sold it? Yeah. His voice cracked slightly on the word. And suddenly he looked less like a successful middle-aged businessman, and more like the little boy who used to cry whenever he disappointed his father. I'm sorry, Mom. I swallowed hard. Part of me wanted to comfort him. That instinct never fully leaves mothers, even wounded ones. But another part of me remained cold and cautious now. Because if Claire truly forged paperwork, if money had been stolen, then this wasn't just family conflict anymore. This was something deeper. Something deliberate. Daniel pulled his phone from his pocket suddenly. There's one more thing you need to see. He tapped the screen a few times before placing the phone gently in front of me. It was a scanned copy of the Mustang's transfer paperwork. I stared at the signature line. My name sat there in shaky cursive. Evelyn Harper. But it wasn't my handwriting. Not even close. A cold wave moved through my body so fast I actually stopped breathing for a second. Daniel's voice came quietly from across the table. Mom. I looked up slowly. And for the first time since Frank died, I saw genuine fear in my son's eyes. I barely recognized the signature. At first glance it looked convincing enough. The same looping E. The same long tail beneath the Y in Evelyn. But the longer I stared at it, the more wrong it became. Too shaky. Too forced. Like someone had copied my handwriting while looking at another document beside them. This isn't mine, I whispered. Daniel sank slowly into the chair across from me. His face looked pale now, almost sick. I know. The kitchen suddenly felt colder than before. I pushed the phone away carefully, as though touching it too long might somehow make the whole thing real. Outside, snow tapped softly against the windows while the old heater hummed through the house. Ordinary sounds. But nothing felt ordinary anymore. When did you get this? I asked. This morning. I called the dealership after I left here. Dealership. The word made my stomach twist. Frank would have hated knowing strangers inspected his Mustang under bright showroom lights while I sat here believing it was safely covered in our garage. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. The salesman emailed me the transfer documents after I explained there might have been a mistake. Mistake. We were both still trying to use gentle words. Neither of us was ready yet for the uglier ones. Forgery. Theft. Betrayal. I stood slowly and walked toward the kitchen sink, needing movement just to steady myself. My reflection in the dark window startled me for a moment. I looked older today. Not because of wrinkles. Because trust had a way of aging people overnight. You know what hurts the most? I said quietly without turning around. Daniel stayed silent. She watched me grieve your father every single day. My voice cracked slightly then. Every day. I remembered sitting alone on the back porch after Frank's funeral, while Claire wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. I'll take care of everything, she promised gently. Back then her kindness felt sincere. Now that memory made my skin crawl. Daniel stared down at the paperwork again. I don't understand why she'd do this. But I was beginning to. Not fully. Not yet. Still, little pieces had started fitting together inside my head. Claire's obsession with simplifying finances after Frank got sick. Her insistence on organizing passwords and account folders. The way she slowly inserted herself into every important conversation during those final months. At the time I thought she was helping because Daniel was overwhelmed. Now I wondered if she'd simply recognized an opportunity. Grief leaves doors open inside a family. Some people walk through those doors to comfort you. Others walk Through carrying empty boxes, Daniel suddenly looked up. There's more paperwork missing. I turned slowly. What do you mean? I checked Dad's storage file in our cloud account. Several scanned documents were deleted last summer. A strange numbness spread through my chest. Frank had always been meticulous with paperwork. Insurance forms, titles, warranties, tax returns from 20 years ago stacked neatly inside labeled folders. Nothing disappeared accidentally in Frank's world. Deleted by who? I asked quietly. Daniel hesitated. The login came from Claire's laptop. There it was again. That awful silence. The kind that grows heavier every time another truth enters the room. I walked into the living room and lowered myself carefully into Frank's recliner. I almost never sat there. It had always been his chair. But right then I needed to feel close to him somehow. The leather still carried the faint scent of cedar and aftershave. I closed my eyes briefly. And suddenly memories started surfacing one after another. Not happy memories. Warnings. Tiny moments I ignored because I wanted peace more than suspicion. Last Easter, Claire casually asking whether Frank ever updated the will before he died. The summer barbecue where she joked that maintaining my property alone was probably unrealistic at Evelyn's age. The afternoon I caught her photographing documents in my office and she laughed it off by saying she was trying to help organize files. At the time, every explanation sounded reasonable. Now every memory carried sharp edges. Daniel appeared quietly in the doorway. I feel stupid, he admitted. I opened my eyes. You trusted your wife. Yeah, but I trusted her over you. That sentence hurt him to say. I could hear it. I looked at my son standing there with slumped shoulders and exhausted eyes, and suddenly I saw how manipulation works inside families. It rarely begins with giant lies. It starts with small adjustments, tiny doubts, little shifts in loyalty repeated over years, until one day a son questions his own mother without even realizing it happened. I should have noticed sooner, he whispered. I thought about answering, about comforting him, but another memory interrupted me first. 2 months before Frank died, he asked me something strange while we sat together watching rain through the garage windows. If anything ever feels off after I'm gone, he said quietly, promise me you'll pay attention. At the time I thought he was worried about me living alone. Now I wondered if he saw tension building inside the family long before I did. Frank noticed things other people missed, especially about character. Daniel sat on the edge of the couch. What do we do now? The question hung between us heavily. Outside, the wind howled softly against the side of the house. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily forward, each second sounding louder than usual. I stared toward the garage again. Empty. That emptiness suddenly felt symbolic somehow. Not just of the car. Of everything that had quietly disappeared from this family, while I was too busy mourning to notice. Finally I spoke. I want to know exactly how far this goes. Daniel frowned slightly. What do you mean? I looked directly at him. If Claire sold the Mustang using forged paperwork, I paused carefully, then I need to know what else she touched. Daniel stayed for another hour. We spread paperwork across my dining room table like detectives rebuilding a crime scene. Bank statements, insurance renewals, old registration documents, tax folders Frank had labeled in his neat block handwriting years ago. The deeper we looked, the quieter Daniel became. I noticed it first when he stopped defending Claire. Earlier that morning, every sentence from him had included excuses. Maybe there's a misunderstanding. Maybe she forgot. Maybe the money got moved somewhere else. But by late afternoon, the excuses disappeared. Facts have a way of stripping emotion down to bone. Snow continued falling outside while the daylight faded into a pale gray blur across the windows. The dining room lamp cast a warm circle of light over the paperwork between us. And right in the middle sat the forged Mustang title transfer. Like poison. Daniel leaned back heavily in his chair. There are withdrawals here I don't recognize. I looked toward the statement he was holding. Small amounts. $1,200. $850. $2,400. Spread across nearly 11 months. Individually, they didn't look alarming. Together, they totaled almost $20,000. My stomach tightened. Were they from your account? Our joint savings. He swallowed hard before adding quietly, "The account we were using for Emily's college fund." I closed my eyes briefly. That explained something I'd overheard at my birthday dinner. Earlier that evening, before everything exploded, Emily had mentioned maybe transferring to a cheaper state school after sophomore year. Claire immediately changed the subject. Before Daniel could respond, at the time I thought nothing of it. Now every conversation felt different in hindsight. Like rereading a letter after discovering someone lied in the first paragraph. Daniel suddenly stood up and walked toward the hallway, pacing again. "She always handled the bills," he muttered. "I trusted her with all of it." I watched my son carefully. There's a specific kind of pain that comes when a good man realizes he ignored warning signs because love made him comfortable. It ages them instantly. "She knew exactly what she was doing," I said softly. Daniel stopped pacing. "You really think this was intentional?" I almost laughed. Not because anything felt funny. Because mothers spend years pretending not to see uncomfortable truths inside their families. But eventually reality becomes too large to ignore. "Daniel," I said gently, "people don't accidentally forge signatures." The room went silent again. He sat back down slowly. Then after a long pause he whispered something that broke my heart. "I don't know who my wife is anymore." For a moment, all I saw was the little boy who used to wait by the front window every evening for Frank to come home from work. The same boy who cried for 2 days after his first breakup at 16. Daniel always loved deeply. That was his strength. And maybe his weakness. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "You don't have to figure everything out tonight." But he shook his head slowly. "There's something else I never told you." A knot tightened in my stomach. "What is it?" Daniel looked ashamed now. "About 6 months ago, Claire asked me whether your house was fully paid off." I frowned slightly. "She already knew it was." "I know." His voice dropped lower. "She kept asking what would happen to the property eventually. Whether you plan to downsize. Whether you'd ever consider assisted living." Cold moved through me again. Slow. Sharp. I remembered Claire bringing brochures for retirement communities during Thanksgiving last year. At the time, she presented them with fake concern. "You shouldn't be alone in such a large house, Evelyn." Frank had died barely 8 months earlier. I remembered how quickly she tried steering conversations toward my future, my finances, my living situation. Back then, grief made me passive. Now I saw strategy hiding beneath sympathy. Daniel stared toward the dark garage outside. "She told me she worried you'd become isolated here." "Did you believe her?" He hesitated. That hesitation answered enough. A painful ache spread through my chest then, but strangely it wasn't anger anymore. It was clarity. The kind that arrives quietly after denial finally collapses. Claire hadn't simply stolen money. She had been repositioning people. Shaping narratives. Creating an image of me as fragile, forgetful, dependent. Because dependent people are easier to control. And older women especially become invisible in ways younger people rarely notice. People stop asking permission. Stop explaining things. Stop seeing you as fully capable. I stood slowly and walked toward the hallway closet where Frank kept his lockbox. Daniel looked up immediately. "What's in there?" "Copies." Frank believed in backups for everything. Inside the small fireproof box sat folders neatly labeled in his handwriting. Property records. Vehicle documents. Insurance information. And underneath them all, a sealed envelope. My name written across the front. "Evelyn, open if something ever feels wrong." My hand started trembling before I even touched it. Daniel stared at the envelope. "Dad wrote that." I nodded slowly. The room suddenly felt very still. Almost sacred. Carefully, I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. Frank's handwriting filled the page in steady blue ink. If you're reading this, then my instincts were probably right. I tried to ignore certain things for Daniel's sake, but I noticed Claire asking too many questions about money, titles, and accounts long before I got sick. "Be careful who handles paperwork after I'm gone." And "Evelyn, trust yourself more than your guilt." I stopped reading. My vision blurred instantly. Not from weakness. From the crushing realization that Frank saw the danger before either of us did. Daniel looked completely stunned. "He never told me any of this." "No, y whisperat." Frank probably hoped he was wrong. Good men often do. I folded the letter carefully against my chest while the house settled softly around us in the winter silence. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I understood something clearly. This was never only about the Mustang. The car was simply the first thing I discovered missing. That night after Daniel left, I walked through the house turning off lights one room at a time. The living room lamp, the hallway chandelier, the small kitchen light above the stove. Simple routines. Normal routines. But nothing about my life felt normal anymore. Frank's letter remained folded inside my cardigan pocket all evening. I kept touching it unconsciously, as though feeling the paper against my fingertips somehow kept me steady. Outside, the storm had worsened. Snow swept across the yard in thick waves beneath the porch light. The old maple branches scraped softly against the roof like fingernails. I stood for a long time beside the garage window. Empty. I still couldn't fully accept it. That Mustang had lived in our family longer than Claire had. Frank bought it at 23 years old with overtime money from the steel plant. Back then the paint was faded, the seats torn, and half the engine barely worked. But Frank loved restoring broken things. Cars, furniture, people. Especially people. That was probably why he tried so hard with Claire in the beginning. I remembered the first Christmas after Daniel married her. Claire complained casually that the condo they rented felt embarrassingly small compared to her friends' homes. 3 weeks later, Frank quietly helped them with a down payment. No need to tell anyone, he told me afterward. He always protected people's pride. 2 years later, when Daniel's company struggled during the recession, Frank loaned them nearly $30,000 without paperwork. Claire cried when he offered it. Actually cried. Back then I believed those tears were gratitude. Now I wondered whether they had been relief. The memories kept coming after that. Little things. Sharp little things. The time Claire insisted on holding on to spare keys for emergencies. The afternoon I found her searching through Frank's office drawers while he slept upstairs during chemotherapy. The way she once asked me, almost casually, whether Frank planned to divide assets equally in the future. At the time, her questions sounded practical, responsible even. Now every memory carried the same ugly feeling underneath it. Calculation. I made tea around midnight but barely drank it. My appetite had disappeared sometime after my birthday dinner. Even the house itself felt unfamiliar now, as though betrayal had changed the temperature of the walls. At 1 a.m, my phone buzzed. A text from Emily. "Grandma, are you okay?" I stared at the message for several seconds before answering. "I'm all right, sweetheart. Go get some sleep." 3 dots appeared immediately, then disappeared, then returned again. Finally, her next message arrived. "Mom and Dad are fighting." I closed my eyes briefly. Another message came seconds later. I heard Mom crying. That one complicated my anger in ways I didn't expect. Because despite everything, part of me still remembered Claire as the young woman nervously holding Daniel's hand at their wedding rehearsal dinner 15 years ago. She wasn't cruel back then. Or maybe cruelty doesn't arrive all at once. Maybe it grows slowly inside people the same way rust spreads beneath paint. Tiny at first, then suddenly everywhere. I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter. At 7 the next morning, I woke to the sound of tires crunching through snow outside. Daniel again. This time he looked worse. His jaw unshaven. Eyes bloodshot. Winter coat half-zipped against the cold. The second I opened the door, I knew something else had happened. "She lied about more than the Mustang," he said immediately. "No hello. No coffee tray this time. Just exhaustion." I stepped aside quietly and let him enter. Daniel paced across the kitchen while snow melted from his boots onto the hardwood floor. "I confronted her after Emily went upstairs last night," he said. "At first she denied everything. I leaned silently against the counter. Then I showed her the forged signature." He laughed bitterly. Not with humor. With disbelief. "She still tried blaming you somehow." "What did she say?" Daniel looked ashamed even repeating it. "She said grief made you unstable and forgetful. That maybe you agreed to things you couldn't remember anymore." The words hit me hard despite everything. Not because they were believable, because they were deliberate. Claire wasn't panicking randomly. She had already prepared explanations in advance. Narratives. Excuses. Daniel continued pacing. Then I asked where the Mustang money actually went. I held my breath slightly. She admitted some of it paid credit card debt. Some. She wouldn't say how much. The kitchen suddenly felt very small. How much debt? Daniel stared toward the floor. Almost $90,000. I blinked slowly. 90,000. For a moment I genuinely thought I'd misheard him. How is that even possible? She hid most of it from me. Daniel's voice sounded hollow now. Designer stores. Online loans. Luxury trips. Multiple cards I didn't even know existed. I remembered the handbags. The expensive spa weekends. The sudden kitchen remodel. Not random spending after all. Desperation disguised as wealth. Daniel sank heavily into one of the kitchen chairs. She kept saying she was trying to maintain appearances. There was something deeply sad about that sentence. Maintain appearances. As though looking successful mattered more than honesty. More than family. More than dignity. I poured him coffee quietly while he stared blankly at the table. Finally he spoke again. She also admitted she's been borrowing against our home equity. That one nearly took my breath away. Without telling you? She handled most of the refinancing paperwork electronically. I sat down slowly across from him. The storm outside had finally stopped, but the world beyond the windows looked buried beneath white silence. Everything inside this family suddenly felt buried too. Trust. Security. The future Daniel thought he had. After several long moments, he looked up at me with tears finally gathering in his eyes. Real tears this time. Not anger. Not frustration. Grief. I married someone I don't recognize anymore. I reached across the table carefully and covered his shaking hand with mine. And quietly, painfully, I realized something else. Claire hadn't just stolen from me. She had been slowly destroying my son too. Top of form 3 days later I went to the bank. Not because I panicked. Because Frank taught me long ago that calm people survive storms better than emotional ones. The roads were still lined with dirty snow from the weekend storm. Gray slush gathered near curbs as I drove slowly through downtown Columbus in my old Buick. Christmas decorations still hung from lamp posts even though the holidays had passed. Everything looked normal outside. Inside me nothing was. I parked near the bank entrance and sat in the car for a moment gripping the steering wheel. My reflection in the windshield looked unfamiliar again. Older. Sharper somehow. Like grief had finally stepped aside and left room for something colder. The bank lobby smelled faintly of coffee and polished marble. Soft instrumental music drifted through hidden speakers overhead. A young teller smiled politely when I approached the desk. Good morning, Mrs. Harper. I recognized her vaguely. Frank and I had banked there for nearly 30 years. I'd like to review all authorized users connected to my accounts, I said calmly. Her smile faded slightly. Of course. An hour later I sat inside a private office reviewing documents with the branch manager, a silver-haired woman named Patricia. And that was when I discovered Claire's name. Not directly on my checking account. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she had been listed as an emergency administrative contact on several linked financial records after Frank became ill. Patricia adjusted her glasses carefully. These permissions were added electronically during Mr. Harper's hospice period. I stared at the forms. Claire's email address. Claire's phone number. Claire's digital authorization requests. Tiny access points. Quiet little doors. And somehow, while I was focused on keeping my husband alive, Claire had slowly inserted herself into the background systems of my life. My chest tightened painfully. I never approved this, I whispered. Patricia looked uncomfortable. These requests appeared to come from a shared family device. Of course they did. Claire had probably completed them while sitting at my own kitchen table. I suddenly remembered one afternoon during Frank's final month alive. I'd fallen asleep briefly on the couch after spending all night beside his hospital bed. When I woke up, Claire sat nearby using my laptop. At the time she smiled warmly. Just helping organize bills. God help me. I thanked Patricia quietly and requested immediate removal of every authorization connected to Claire. Passwords changed. Account alerts activated. Access revoked. The entire process felt strangely surreal. Like changing locks after realizing someone copied your keys years ago. When I finally stepped outside again, the cold winter air hit my lungs sharply. I stood on the sidewalk for several seconds trying to steady myself. Then my phone rang. Emily. Sweetheart. Her voice sounded shaky immediately. Grandma, can I come see you? Something inside me tightened. Of course. She arrived 40 minutes later still wearing her college sweatshirt and snow boots. The second she stepped inside my house, I knew she'd been crying. Emily had always been terrible at hiding emotions. At 19, she still wore her heart openly across her face the same way Daniel did as a boy. Without saying anything, she wrapped her arms around me tightly in the hallway. And suddenly I realized how long it had been since someone simply hugged me without wanting something in return. We sat together in the kitchen while I made hot chocolate the way Frank used to make it for her after snowstorms. Extra marshmallows. Tiny splash of vanilla. Emily stared into the mug for a long time before speaking. They've been fighting constantly. I stayed quiet. Dad slept downstairs last night. The pain in her voice cut deep. Not because she sounded angry, because she sounded disappointed. Children can survive many things, but discovering their parents are strangers to each other leaves scars that last forever. Finally, Emily looked up at me. I think Mom's been lying about money for a long time. Hearing it aloud from her granddaughter made something inside me sink even further. What makes you say that? Emily hesitated. Then quietly, last year she asked me not to mention a shopping trip to Dad. I frowned slightly. What kind of shopping trip? She bought a bracelet worth almost $12,000. I blinked. $12,000. Emily wiped quickly beneath her eyes. She kept saying Dad was too controlling about finances, and that she deserved nice things after supporting his career. That sounded exactly like Claire. Not fully cruel. Not fully innocent. Always turning selfishness into justification. Emily stared toward the garage through the kitchen window. I didn't know things were this bad. Neither did I. But slowly, painfully, the full picture was beginning to emerge. Not one terrible decision. A lifestyle built on deception. A woman drowning in debt while pretending to live beautifully. And somewhere along the way, my family became part of the collateral damage. Emily suddenly reached into her backpack. There's something else. My stomach tightened immediately. She pulled out a small stack of printed papers folded neatly together. Dad doesn't know I found these. I unfolded the pages carefully. Credit card statements. Loan notices. Past due warnings. One page showed an outstanding balance so large I genuinely thought it had to be a typo. Another included legal language regarding default risk. Then I saw it. A loan application. The collateral section listed my address. My house. Cold swept through me so suddenly my fingers went numb. Emily's voice trembled. I think Mom was planning to borrow against your property somehow. The kitchen went completely silent. Even the heater seemed to stop humming. I stared down at the paperwork while Frank's final letter echoed inside my head again. Be careful who handles paperwork after I'm gone. And for the first time since this began, I realized Claire may never have intended to stop at the Mustang. Daniel came over again that evening. This time he didn't knock. He walked into the house carrying a thick folder under one arm, his expression hollow and exhausted. Snowflakes melted slowly in his dark hair as he shut the front door behind him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us no longer felt awkward now. Just heavy, like two people standing in the wreckage of something they still couldn't fully believe had collapsed. She admitted it, he said finally. I felt my stomach tighten. I set down the dish towel in my hands and looked at him carefully. How much? Daniel gave a bitter laugh. Not enough. He dropped the folder onto the kitchen table. Papers spilled slightly from the sides. Bank records. Loan notices. Printed emails. Evidence. The kind people gather when love turns into legal fear. I sat down slowly while he rubbed both hands across his face. She said the Mustang sale was supposed to be temporary. Temporary. She planned to replace the money before you noticed. I stared at him quietly. That explanation sounded almost childish. Like someone claiming they only borrowed trust instead of stealing it. Daniel paced toward the kitchen window again. She kept saying everything spiraled after the debt got out of control. Outside, evening darkness settled across the snow-covered yard. The garage stood at the edge of the property like a silent witness. Empty. Still empty. I wondered if it would ever stop hurting to look at it. What else did she admit? I asked softly. Daniel hesitated too long. That was answer enough already. Finally, he turned toward me. She used your property information during loan applications. The room went still. Not loud stillness. The dangerous kind. Quiet enough to hear your own heartbeat. I folded my hands tightly together beneath the table. Did she forge anything else? I don't know yet. Yet. Such a terrible word. Daniel sat across from me heavily. She kept crying, he muttered, saying she never meant for things to go this far. I looked down at the folder. People always say that after damage becomes visible. Nobody says it while they're actively causing harm. She blamed pressure, he continued bitterly. Social expectations. Money stress. Keeping up appearances. I thought about Claire's expensive handbags lined neatly in her closet. The luxury vacations posted online with smiling captions. The kitchen remodel she insisted was necessary. A beautiful life built on hidden panic. Daniel suddenly looked older than 42. Not physically. Emotionally. Like betrayal had drained something vital from him. I asked her. One question before I left, he said quietly. I waited. I asked if she ever felt guilty taking advantage of you after Dad died. My chest tightened painfully. What did she say? Daniel stared blankly toward the floor. She said you were lonely and vulnerable anyway. And that eventually everything would belong to me. For several seconds I genuinely couldn't speak. Not because of anger. Because of the coldness behind that sentence. Eventually everything would belong to me. Not memories. Not family. Assets. Property. Ownership. I suddenly understood why Frank became uneasy near the end of his life. He saw greed entering the family quietly, dressed as concern. Daniel's voice cracked suddenly. She talked about your life like a financial timeline. That sentence broke something inside me far more deeply than the stolen car. Because losing money hurts. But becoming reduced to numbers in someone else's plans? That kind of humiliation reaches deeper. I stood slowly and walked toward the sink, needing movement again just to breathe normally. The kitchen lights reflected softly against the dark windows while snow continued falling outside. For years after Frank died, I blamed myself for becoming emotionally distant from everyone. I thought grief had simply made me quieter. Now I realized something else. Somewhere deep inside, maybe I sensed danger long before my mind accepted it. Daniel spoke again behind me. I told her I needed space. I turned slowly. She asked if I was leaving her. The pain in his eyes nearly undid me. And what did you say? A long silence followed. Then quietly, I said I don't even know who she is anymore. The heater kicked softly on overhead, filling the kitchen with low mechanical humming. Ordinary sound. Extraordinary sadness. Daniel looked at me helplessly then, and suddenly I saw both my husband and my son in his face at the same time. Frank's gentleness. Daniel's loyalty. Two good men completely unprepared for someone willing to manipulate love itself. Finally, he pushed the folder toward me. There's something inside you need to see. I opened it carefully. Most of the pages were financial records. Then I noticed a printed email thread. Claire communicating with a private lender. I scanned the lines quickly until one sentence stopped me cold. Once the mother-in-law moves into assisted living, the property situation should become much easier. My vision blurred for a second. Not from age. Not from confusion. From shock so sharp it physically hurt. I read the sentence again. And again. Moves into assisted living. Property situation. Easier. Every brochure. Every gentle suggestion. Every fake conversation about safety and downsizing. It had never been concern. It had been planning. Careful, patient planning. Daniel looked sick watching me read it. I found that in her deleted emails. I lowered the paper slowly onto the table. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then finally, very quietly, I asked the question neither of us wanted answered. How long do you think she's been preparing for this? I didn't answer Daniel's question right away. Because deep down I already knew the truth. This hadn't started with the Mustang. Or the debt. Or even the forged paperwork. People don't wake up one morning and suddenly become capable of betraying family like this. Greed grows quietly, slowly, like mold behind walls. By the time you finally see it, the damage is already everywhere. I think she started planning the moment your father got sick, I said softly. Daniel lowered his head, and neither of us argued with it. The next morning I called Frank's attorney. Martin Lewis had handled our estate planning for over 20 years. Frank trusted him completely, which meant I trusted him too. By noon, I sat inside Martin's downtown office surrounded by dark wooden shelves and the familiar smell of coffee and old paper. Martin looked unusually serious as he reviewed the documents Daniel and I brought. The forged Mustang transfer, the lender emails, the suspicious account activity, the printout mentioning assisted living. When he finished reading, he removed his glasses slowly. "Evelyn," he said carefully, "you absolutely need to protect yourself immediately." The calmness in his voice frightened me more than panic would have. What exactly does that mean? It means changing every legal access point connected to your finances and property before this escalates further. Escalates further. As though things hadn't already exploded enough. Martin spent nearly 2 hours helping me review everything Frank and I owned. The house, savings, investment accounts, insurance policies, vehicle titles. For the first time since Frank died, I looked at my life not emotionally but strategically. That realization made me sadder than I expected. By 3 o'clock, we had already begun making changes. My will updated. Power of attorney revoked and rewritten. Property records flagged for additional verification. A family trust established with strict access limitations. Everything locked down carefully, quietly, professionally. Martin leaned back in his chair after signing the final documents. Frank was worried about outside influence near the end, he admitted gently. I looked up sharply. He told you that? Martin nodded once. He never accused anyone directly, but he specifically requested stronger protections around your home and long-term care decisions. A strange ache spread through my chest. Even dying, Frank was still trying to protect me. I stared down at my wedding ring for several seconds before speaking. I wish I'd listened to him sooner. Martin's expression softened. Evelyn, trusting family is not weakness. Maybe not, but trusting the wrong family can destroy you just the same. When I arrived home that evening, the winter sky had already darkened into deep blue. Snow glittered beneath the porch light like shattered glass. And parked in my driveway sat Claire's white SUV. I stopped walking immediately. For one long moment I simply stared at it. Then I saw her standing near my front porch. Alone. She looked different somehow. Smaller. Her expensive camel-colored coat hung loosely around her shoulders, and dark circles shadowed her eyes beneath carefully applied makeup. The second she saw me, she stepped forward. Evelyn, please. I raised my hand gently. Not angry. Just finished. I'm tired, Claire. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. Real tears this time. Or at least real fear. I know I made mistakes, she whispered. Mistakes. Such soft language for sharp damage. I unlocked the front door slowly but didn't invite her inside. Cold wind moved between us while snow drifted across the porch steps. Claire wrapped her coat tighter around herself. I never wanted things to go this far. I looked at her carefully. You already said that. Her lips trembled slightly. I was drowning financially. So you decided to drown everyone else too? The words came out calmer than I expected. That seemed to unsettle her more than shouting would have. Claire looked down briefly before speaking again. You don't understand the pressure. I almost laughed. Pressure? I buried my husband after 43 years of marriage. I learned how to sleep alone in a silent house. I learned how to keep breathing after watching cancer slowly erase the strongest man I ever knew. And somehow this woman standing on my porch wanted to explain. Pressure to me. You had choices, I said quietly. Her voice cracked. I was trying to hold everything together. No, iyan suarat sufli. You were trying to hold appearances together. That hit her. I saw it immediately. Claire wiped quickly beneath her eyes. Daniel won't answer my calls anymore. For the first time, genuine panic entered her voice. Not sadness over what she'd done. Fear of consequences. I suddenly realized something important then. Claire never believed the truth would surface. She thought grief had made me weak, distracted, easy to move aside. And honestly, for a while maybe she was right. She looked past me toward the house behind my shoulder. Are you changing the estate documents? There it was. Even now, still thinking about property, about assets, about control. I stared at her for several long seconds before answering. Yes. Her face went pale instantly. And in that moment, I finally stopped seeing her as my daughter-in-law. She became something else entirely. A stranger who entered my family carrying hunger none of us recognized until it was too late. Claire's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Daniel said you don't trust me anymore. The sadness I felt then surprised me. Not because I pitied her. Because once upon a time I truly loved her. I trusted you after Frank died, I said quietly. That was the worst time to betray someone. Tears rolled silently down her face now. But I noticed something important. She still never apologized specifically. Not for the forged signature. Not for the stolen money. Not for trying to push me toward assisted living. Only vague sorrow. Vague regret. The kind people offer when they mourn consequences more than actions. Finally, I stepped inside the house. Before closing the door, I looked at her one last time standing beneath the porch light in the falling snow. And very calmly I said, You didn't just steal a car, Claire. I paused. You stole the last peaceful year my husband thought this family still had. Daniel filed for legal separation 2 days later. He didn't announce it dramatically. No screaming. No broken dishes. No scene worthy of television. Just a quiet phone call around 8 in the morning, while I stood at the kitchen sink watering Frank's old ivy plant. I moved into a hotel, he said. For a moment neither of us spoke. Outside the snow had finally stopped. Sunlight reflected sharply off the white yard, making everything painfully bright. How are the kids? I asked softly. Emily was 19. Mason only 8. Children always become the invisible victims when adults build lives on lies. Daniel exhaled heavily. Emily barely talks to Claire. And Mason? He doesn't understand what's happening. That broke my heart the most. Children should worry about homework and cartoons, not financial fraud and collapsing marriages. I closed my eyes briefly. I'm sorry, Daniel. The line went quiet. Then my son whispered something that nearly made me cry. No, Mom. I'm sorry. After we hung up, I stood motionless in the kitchen for a long time. The house felt unusually still that morning. Even the old grandfather clock seemed quieter somehow. A family can survive hardship, illness, loss, even death sometimes. But deception poisons people slowly from the inside. And once trust dies, everything else begins collapsing around it. Later that afternoon, Martin called with more updates. We traced the lender communications, he explained carefully. Claire submitted preliminary property inquiries using information connected to your home. I gripped the phone tighter. Could she have actually taken the house? Not yet, Martin reassured me quickly. But she was clearly preparing pathways. Preparing pathways. Such clean legal language for something so ugly. He continued speaking calmly. There's another issue, Evelyn. My stomach tightened immediately. One of the lenders flagged inconsistencies involving retirement planning documentation. I frowned. What does that mean? It means someone may have attempted to present you as mentally declining in order to justify future financial oversight. The room tilted slightly. I sat down immediately at the kitchen table. Mental decline. The phrase echoed horribly in my head. Suddenly, every little comment Claire made over the past year rearranged itself into something terrifying. You seem forgetful lately. Maybe Daniel should help manage things. This house feels too overwhelming for someone your age. She wasn't expressing concern. She was building a narrative. A paper trail. A version of me weak enough to move aside legally. I pressed trembling fingers against my forehead. Oh my God. Martin's voice softened. This happens more often than people realize. That sentence chilled me deeply. More often than people realize. How many older women quietly lose control of their lives because someone younger decides grief equals weakness? After hanging up, I walked slowly into Frank's office. I hadn't touched much in there since he died. His leather chair still faced the desk at the same angle. Pens arranged neatly beside yellow legal pads. Reading glasses folded carefully near the lamp. Frank believed organization solved problems. Maybe that's why chaos feels so disrespectful after someone like him is gone. I opened the bottom filing drawer slowly. Inside sat dozens of folders arranged alphabetically. And tucked between insurance records and tax returns, I found something unexpected. A small spiral notebook labeled simply, Family. I sat down immediately. Most pages contained ordinary things. Birthdays, gift ideas, vacation notes. But halfway through the notebook, Frank's handwriting changed slightly. Sharper. More deliberate. Claire asks too many questions about Evelyn's future finances. Another page. Daniel trusts too easily. Another. Need stronger legal protections before treatment worsens. Tears blurred my vision instantly. Not because Frank suspected danger. Because he carried that worry alone while fighting cancer. I turned another page carefully. If anything happens to me, Evelyn must never feel pressure to leave this house. That sentence destroyed me. I bent forward quietly, pressing my hand against my mouth while grief moved through me so suddenly it almost felt physical again. Even dying, Frank was still trying to protect me from loneliness, from manipulation, from exactly this. The front doorbell startled me nearly an hour later. I quickly wiped my face and walked downstairs. Emily stood outside holding Mason's hand. The moment I opened the door, Mason rushed forward and wrapped both arms around my waist. "Grandma," he mumbled against my sweater. I held him tightly. Children seek safety instinctively when their world begins shaking. Emily looked exhausted. "I'm sorry we didn't call first." "You never have to call first." Her eyes immediately filled with tears at that. I brought them inside while Mason wandered toward the living room television. Emily stayed behind in the kitchen. "She left," she whispered suddenly. I froze. "Claire." Emily nodded slowly. "She packed bags this morning after Dad told her he spoke to an attorney." I leaned quietly against the counter. "And?" Emily swallowed hard. She kept saying everyone was turning against her. There was something tragically human about that sentence. Because in Claire's mind, maybe she truly believed herself to be the victim now. People who justify dishonesty long enough eventually stop recognizing reality clearly. Emily wiped quickly beneath her eyes. "I don't know how our family got here." Neither did I. Not fully. But I was finally beginning to understand something painful. Families rarely break apart in one dramatic moment. Usually they erode slowly. Tiny lies. Small manipulations. Little acts of selfishness repeated quietly over years. Until suddenly the foundation gives way beneath everyone at once. From the living room, Mason's small voice called out, "Grandma, can we watch Grandpa's car videos?" My chest tightened instantly. Frank used to record little restoration videos in the garage with Mason sitting beside him asking endless questions about engines. I looked toward the living room doorway, then back at Emily. And softly, almost to myself, I said, "She stole more than money from us." The divorce moved faster than I expected. Not because Daniel was cruel. Because once trust shattered completely, there wasn't much left to negotiate. 3 weeks after my birthday dinner, Claire moved into a downtown apartment on the other side of Columbus. Emily stayed mostly with Daniel. Mason split his time between both parents, though lately he clung to his father more than usual. Children always sense instability before adults admit it exists. The house grew quieter after that. Not peaceful quiet. Recovering quiet. Like a room after paramedics leave. One cold Sunday afternoon, Daniel came over carrying 2 cardboard storage boxes from the garage at the family home. "Thought these belonged here," he said softly. Inside were Frank's old tools. Wrenches carefully wrapped in cloth. Oil-stained work gloves. The small silver radio he kept beside the Mustang while he worked. I touched the radio gently and felt my throat tighten. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then Daniel sat heavily at the kitchen table and stared down at his hands. "I keep replaying everything," he admitted quietly. I poured coffee for both of us before answering. "That's normal." "No," he said bitterly. "What's normal is protecting your mother after your father dies." The pain in his voice cut deep. I sat across from him carefully. Claire manipulated all of us, Daniel. But I helped her without realizing it. That part was true. And we both knew it. Not intentionally. Not maliciously. But loyalty without awareness can still cause damage. Daniel rubbed his forehead slowly. She admitted something else before she left. I stayed quiet. She said she always felt judged by Dad. That surprised me slightly. Frank rarely judged people openly. But he noticed character quickly. What exactly did she mean? I asked. Daniel gave a tired shrug. She said he never fully trusted her around money. A strange sadness moved through me then. Frank saw danger. Daniel saw love. And somewhere between those two realities our family cracked apart. Daniel looked toward the garage outside through the kitchen window. I found something in the storage unit yesterday. He reached into one of the boxes and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was an old photograph. Frank and Daniel standing beside the Mustang 15 years earlier, both smiling beneath bright summer sunlight. Daniel's arm rested proudly across his father's shoulder. On the back, Frank had written, "One day this car belongs to Daniel, if he learns that people matter more than possessions." I closed my eyes briefly. Even in simple notes, Frank taught lessons quietly. Daniel stared at the handwriting for a long moment before speaking again. I failed him. "No," I said softly. "You trusted the wrong person. That's different." But he still looked unconvinced. Outside, winter sunlight faded slowly across the snow-covered yard. The maple tree branches swayed gently in the cold wind while the old porch chimes rattled softly. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary afternoon. Yet everything about our family felt permanently altered now. A week later, Martin called with final updates regarding the financial investigation. Most of the missing money would never fully return. The Mustang itself had already been resold privately to a collector in Arizona. Gone. Just gone. Oddly enough, hearing that brought less pain than I expected, because by then I finally understood something important. The car had never been the true loss. Trust was. Martin's voice softened near the end of the call. "There's one more thing you should know, Evelyn." My stomach tightened automatically now whenever people used that tone. Claire attempted to contact the lenders again after Daniel filed separation paperwork. I frowned. Why? She tried withdrawing the property inquiries. That almost made me laugh. Not from humor. From exhaustion. Even now, she was still trying to control the damage instead of facing it honestly. After the call ended, I walked slowly into the garage alone for the first time in weeks. The emptiness inside still startled me. Without the Mustang, the space looked too large. Too hollow. I ran my fingers across Frank's old workbench where tiny scratches and oil stains remained beneath years of use. Then, I noticed something sitting near the back wall beneath a tarp. Another car. Smaller. Older. Frank's first restoration project from decades ago. A faded 1957 Chevrolet pickup he never quite finished rebuilding. I pulled the tarp back slowly. Dust covered the windshield, but beneath it the truck remained solid and beautiful in its own worn way. Suddenly, I remembered something Frank once told Mason while they worked in the garage together. "The secret to restoring old things," he said, "is deciding they're still worth saving." I stood there for a very long time staring at the unfinished truck. And quietly, for the first time since all this began, I realized he wasn't only talking about cars. That evening, Daniel and the kids came over for dinner. Simple meal. Botruast. Mashed potatoes. Warm bread. Nothing fancy. Halfway through dinner, Mason looked up suddenly. "Grandma." "Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Grandpa would be mad at us?" The table went completely silent. Emily looked down immediately. Daniel froze with his fork halfway to his mouth. I reached across gently and squeezed Mason's small hand. "No," I said softly. "I think Grandpa would want us to learn from all this." Mason frowned slightly. "Learn what?" I looked around the table carefully before answering. "That love without honesty eventually breaks people." No one spoke after that. But for the first time in a long while, the silence no longer felt cold. It felt truthful. And somehow that was the beginning of healing. Spring arrived quietly that year. By late March, the snow had melted from the yard, revealing patches of green beneath the maple tree outside my kitchen window. Birds returned to the feeder Frank built years ago, and for the first time in months, I opened the windows and let fresh air move through the house. Healing doesn't happen dramatically. It happens in tiny moments. Opening curtains again. Cooking meals because you're hungry instead of lonely. Laughing once without guilt. The divorce between Daniel and Claire finalized in early April. In the end, there wasn't much left to fight over. Most of the hidden debt belonged solely to Claire. The court records described the financial deception in cold legal language that somehow made everything feel even sadder. Unauthorized transfers. Misrepresentation. Forgery concerns. Words on paper. But behind those words sat a broken family. Daniel changed after the divorce. Quieter. More thoughtful. Sometimes. Grief matures people in painful ways. He spent more weekends at my house after that, usually with Mason tagging behind him carrying toy tools and endless questions exactly the way Daniel once followed Frank through the garage years ago. And slowly life began stitching itself back together. Not perfectly. Never perfectly. But honestly. One Saturday morning in May, Mason ran into the kitchen breathless with excitement. "Grandma, Dad says we can fix Grandpa's truck." I looked out the window toward the garage where Daniel stood beside the old Chevrolet pickup with the hood raised. Sunlight spilled across the driveway while birds chirped loudly from the trees overhead. For a moment the sight hurt. Then strangely it healed something too. That afternoon, the three of us spent hours in the garage together. Daniel sorted tools while Mason handed us wrenches much too proudly for someone his size. And for the first time since Frank died, laughter returned to that garage. Real laughter. Not forced. Not careful. At one point, Daniel wiped grease from his hands and looked toward me quietly. "I finally understand why Dad loved working out here so much." I smiled softly. It wasn't just the cars. He nodded slowly. Yeah, now he understood. Garages weren't really about engines and tools for Frank. They were places where broken things got patience instead of judgment. Where time slowed down enough for people to repair what mattered. Near sunset, I stepped outside alone for a moment while Daniel and Mason continued arguing playfully about engine parts inside the garage. Warm wind moved gently through the trees. Somewhere nearby, a lawnmower hummed across the neighborhood. The world felt ordinary again. And after everything that happened, ordinary suddenly felt precious. My phone buzzed softly in my pocket. A message from Claire. I stared at the screen for several long seconds. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I truly am sorry for what I destroyed. No excuses this time. No manipulation. Just one sentence. I looked at the message quietly while evening sunlight stretched gold across the yard. Then, after a long moment, I locked the phone and slipped it back into my pocket unanswered. Not out of hatred, but because some apologies arrived too late to rebuild what they broke. Inside the garage, Mason suddenly shouted excitedly. It started! Grandpa's truck started! The engine roared roughly to life a second later. Daniel laughed loudly. And for one impossible moment, the sound echoed so much like Frank's laughter that tears instantly filled my eyes. I stood there in the warm spring air listening to that engine rumble through the evening. And finally, after 2 long years of grief, I felt something loosen inside me. Not forgetting. Not complete peace. But acceptance. Frank was gone. The Mustang was gone. Even the family I thought I had was gone in some ways. But not everything had been stolen. Love remained. Truth remained. And standing there watching my son and grandson covered in grease inside that old garage, I realized something important. Greed may destroy families. But honesty is what rebuilds them. Later that night, after Daniel and Mason drove home, I walked alone through the quiet house turning off lights one by one. The same routine. The same rooms. Yet everything felt different now. Lighter somehow. When I reached the living room, I paused beside Frank's recliner and looked toward the garage through the dark window. Then softly, almost like a prayer, I whispered, "You were right, Frank." The house remained silent around me. But for the first time in a very long while, the silence no longer felt lonely. Bottom of form.